Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 19 of Divine Poetry. In this episode, I don't want to talk about any parallels per se, although I will touch upon them. I want to introduce to you my new book. It's called Vatican II and Antichrist, which is a huge title, and I'm very nervous and excited to bring the book out to you. It should be available sometime in towards the end of July. I plan on launching it on July 16th, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So, as many of you are aware, and maybe many of you have actually read my first book called Divine Poetry. So Divine Poetry, for those of you who aren't aware, it shows that the Catholic Church's history was prefigured by the Old Testament in chronological order from start to finish. Now, this new book, Vatican II and Antichrist, is based on that book. I would never be able to write this book, Vatican II and Antichrist, if I didn't first, see and document those parallels between church history and the Old Testament, which I would like to say that it's impossible for me to have made those up. I mean, I did present them, and I have researched them and studied them and, wrote about them for many years, but the parallels themselves had to have been put there by God, obviously. No one else could have done that. And one of the proofs for us as traditional Catholics is that Vatican II is prefigured in the Old Testament by the books of the Maccabees. So the books of the Maccabees, as you also may be aware, are the very end of the Old Testament. So here we have church history being prefigured by the Old Testament, and we appear to be in parallel at the end of church history. I don't know, it's a very simple conclusion to make because, we've been following the Old Testament the whole time. So I guess I'll quickly go through these parallels with Vatican II because it sets the foundation for this next book. So I won't belabor the point too much because I'm sure many of you are already aware of that. And if you want to find out more about what I'm about to say, go back to episodes, 4, 5, and 6 of this series, Divine Poetry, on this YouTube channel, and you can see more in detail what I'm talking about. But basically, at the end of the Old Testament, you have an evil Greek king. His name is Antiochus, and that's important. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's the one who strips the ornaments out of the temple. He puts up a second altar in the temple, says over and against the altar of God. He mandates the abomination of desolation, which he places on that second altar, and then he outlaws the traditional Old Testament sacrifices and practices. Any Jew in the Old Testament who wanted to maintain the Old Testament covenant was persecuted, and they fled to the mountains. Now, we have here Vatican II in parallel. We have a new second altar at Vatican II. We have the ornaments stripped out. We have the mandating of the Novus Ordo rite only on the second altar, and the outlawing of the Tridentine Mass. And all of that, again, is presented in the book Divine Poetry, which, by the way, I highly recommend if you haven't read it yet. I mean, definitely read it. Obviously, I'm biased. But, if you can't purchase the book, that's fine. All the material is also available on my website, MaccabeanUprising.com. So, it's the same information. But the reason why I say read it or get the information somehow is because this book, Vatican II and Antichrist, is based primarily on those set of parallels specifically. So to kind of see how I'm able to write a book called Vatican II and Antichrist, let me, in this episode of Divine Poetry, let me go through and lay out the foundation that sets the stage for this book, right? So first, we have in the book of Daniel in the footnotes, we have, I'm going to read you a set of footnotes that clearly tie together the idea of Antiochus, the Greek king, and the Antichrist. So I'm just going to read these and we'll move on from there. All right. This is from Daniel 7, verse 8. Another little horn. This is commonly understood of Antichrist. It may also be applied to the great persecutor Antiochus Epiphanes as a figure of Antichrist. Okay, now we have Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. Antiochus Epiphanes, a descendant of Seleucus, he grew against the south and to the east by his victories over the kings of Egypt and Armenia, and against the strength, that is, against Jerusalem and the people of God. Now, the people of God in church history are not Jerusalem, but Rome and Catholics. The abomination of desolation. Some understood, this is by the way from Daniel 9, verse 27, some understand this to be a profanation of the temple by the crimes of the Jews and by a bloody faction of the zealots, others of the bringing in thither of ensigns and the standard of the pagan Romans. Others, in fine, distinguish three different times of desolation. That under Antiochus, that when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and the last, near the end of the world, under Antichrist. To all of which, as they suppose, this prophecy may have a relation. Okay, now we have the chapter heading in the Douay-Rheims Bible for Daniel 11. The angel declares to Daniel many things to come, with regard to the Persian and Grecian kings, more especially with regard to Antiochus as a figure of Antichrist. And then again from Daniel 11, verse 21, one despised, Antiochus Epiphanes, who at first was despised and not received for king, but here said of this prince is accommodated by St. Jerome and others to Antichrist, of whom this Antiochus was a figure. Okay, and so there you have the book of Daniel and the footnotes in the Douay-Rheims Bible clearly link, more than anybody else, Antiochus with Antichrist. Now, the reason why that's important, let me just stress again, is because we have the parallels between church history and the Old Testament. And we have Antiochus puts the abomination of desolation on the second altar in the temple. And we're told through the footnotes over and over again that Antiochus is a prefigurement of Antichrist. So it begs the question, if we have parallels for Antiochus in the books of the Maccabees and church history, namely Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo, can we pursue those parallels any further to gain more understanding of Antichrist? Because they're linked, right? I'm going to read you now a quote from St. Alphonsus in his book, and I forget the book and chapter, but I'll put that on the screen. But here's the actual quote, and I'll cite it below me as I talk. St. Alphonsus says this. He says, "And this offering which our Lord then made of himself did not limit itself to that moment." He's talking about the Holy Mass. But it only then began. It always has continued since, and it will continue forever. It is true it will cease on earth at the time of Antichrist. The sacrifice of the Mass is to be suspended for 1290 days, that is, for 3 years, 6 months and a half, according to the prophecy of Daniel. Now, so St. Alphonsus now links that because in the book of Daniel we see Antiochus doing the abomination, which was clearly just referenced in the footnotes. Therefore, the Antichrist will cease, he'll suspend the Mass for a certain period of time. So he's also linking Daniel, the Mass, and the abomination indirectly, but you can see, right? Now, I'm going to quote our Lord from the Gospel of St. Matthew, and we're all familiar with this. Our Lord says, "When you see the abomination in the holy place spoken of by the prophet Daniel, flee to the mountains." So the question would always be, therefore, well, what abomination of desolation are we to look for that our Lord is warning us against? And first I would say that there have been many abominations of desolation, and I get into that in the book. But the preeminent one, the final one, I guess I would say, would have to be that which St. Alphonsus just referenced, the one that stops the Mass across the world. And that would be, we have a parallel for that, right? So the abomination of desolation in the Old Testament was the new profane sacrifice on the new second altar. And we have, like we've just been covering, that happened with Paul VI in the Novus Ordo, right? Where he mandated the Novus Ordo, and it's invalid, right? And the Tridentine Mass was outlawed. So effectively, the true sacrifice ceased on the earth. And I'm going to get into how that happened for 3.5 years. Maybe I won't get into it in this video, but I'll get into it in my book for sure. So we put all these things together, and it forms the basis of a book. Now, if you go back to episode 12 of this Divine Poetry series, okay, I do a video about the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years from the book of Daniel. And the reason why that's significant is because that prophecy also mentions the abomination of desolation, right? So if our Lord says, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel, and then we can identify now what that is based on these parallels between church history and the Old Testament, Then I simply did what our Lord said to do, go to the book of Daniel. And I scoured through the book of Daniel, and I found this prophecy where it mentions the abomination of desolation. Now, the prophecy of 70 weeks, as you can see, go back and watch that video. It's episode 12 if you haven't watched it already. It's a timeline that tells you when the abomination is going to appear. And it's going to appear, critically here, it's going to appear at the midpoint of what's called the final week. And you'll see that in that prophecy, I've identified the final week, which is the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929 and the resignation of Benedictus XVI in 2013, both of which occurred on February 11th. In that interim period of February 11th, 2029 and February 11th, 2013, there were 7 priest kings of Vatican City. And then, of course, Benedict resigns, lightning strikes the Vatican, punctuating the end of this period of the final week and the period of 7 kings. Now, excuse me, the midpoint of that period is 1971, right? Because 1971 is 42 years from both Benedict's resignation and the signing of the Lateran Treaty. And 1971 is when Paul VI universally mandated the Novus Ordo rite. That's when bishops in their diocese could permit the Tridentine Mass until 1971. So there's the midpoint, and that's when the abomination appears definitively. So all of this is tying together very neatly, and it's all centered around the Tridentine Mass. It's all centered around the concepts of the faith. That's why it's so convincing to me, is because it's the prophecy seems to be validating and supporting traditional Catholicism, and particularly Sedevacantism. A little bit more to go here. There's other prophecies in the book of Daniel, many of them. And they all have new fulfillments if you consider the parallels. Because in the footnotes of the book of Daniel, it tells you this prophecy is about Alexander the Great, and this prophecy is about the Persians, and this prophecy is about the Seleucids. Now, why that's significant is because they all have direct corresponding parallels in church history based on this whole system in the book Divine Poetry. So you can take those same figures from church history that parallel the Old Testament ones, and the prophecies run again, but they come to the same conclusions as well. And I guess that's too much to do in one video, but that's going to be in the book, right? So let me just kind of end with this before I introduce the book to you officially. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 25, it says, "And he shall speak words against the High One, and shall crush the saints of the Most High, and he shall think himself able to change times and laws, and they shall be delivered into his hands until a time, times, and a half time." That's a reference to Antichrist. In the future, it's in church history, it's a reference to Antiochus in the Old Testament, and that's what the footnotes tell us. It's a reference to both. That's what the whole point of linking the two is about. So what's significant here is that two things: that he will do it for a time, times, and a half time, and that he will be able to change times and laws, and he will crush the saints. Right? Now go to the book of the Apocalypse, because what I want to show in this book is that the book of the Apocalypse and the book of Daniel are structurally linked together by this period of 3.5 times, right? And also by the idea that the bad guy will crush the saints. So let me read you this passage from the book of the Apocalypse now to show you how it's linked, at least partially. Okay, this is from Apocalypse 13, verses 5 to 7. And he's talking about this beast out of the sea that has 7 heads, right? And but this as a footnote, the 7 heads are told to us in the text of the Apocalypse itself, are told to us to be 7 kings. Now we already have 7 kings in this prophecy of Daniel, right? So already the 7 kings pops right up as a similarity. "And there was given to him a mouth speaking great things, and blasphemies, and power was given to him to do 42 months. And he opened his mouth unto blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation." So in the Apocalypse, this beast has power over the saints for 42 months. Okay, upon analyzing these time periods in the Apocalypse and the time period given in Daniel, we see it's the same period of time. So 3.5 times is the same as 42 months. It's the same as 1,260 days, as this chart shows. It's just a matter of translating the period of time from days to months to years. But all three are equivalent. It's the same expression, just given in different units of time. So if in the book of Daniel, the abomination appears at the midpoint of the final week. And if the beast crushes the saints in the book of the Apocalypse for 42 months, then the question would have to be, who are the saints is one question. Now, the saints can only be Catholics or Catholic saints, right? And it says the tabernacle here. The tabernacle can only be a Catholic church, at its root meaning. No other meaning would be true. That I would say, based on these correspondences of everything I just mentioned, that the reason why the beast can crush the saints is because of the Novus Ordo. That's what gave the beast power over the saints. Every Catholic in the church in 1971 just had the Mass taken away from them. All right, so if anything would cause the beast to crush the saints, it's the removal of the Mass. Okay, that's probably too much. I will say also this, is that because now that structural link, now we can also look at all of the other items in the book of the Apocalypse. Now that the context is given, we can see the two-horned lamb, which is the beast that follows the seven-headed beast out of the sea. We can see the mark of the beast, the two witnesses. All these things have a new context, and the structural link all gives them an interpretation. And the interpretation is all centered around the Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo. I guess I don't want to reiterate everything I just said, but the strength of the interpretation comes from the linking that's primarily based upon divine poetry and the parallels between the Second Vatican Council and the Antiochus and the books of the Maccabees. Okay, I can keep on going and going and going. That's why I wrote a book about it. That's why I wrote a book about it instead. So the book, like I said, A Vatican to an Antichrist. Here's the cover of the book. All right, and I really think it's going to be published on July 16th. I'm going to be working really hard to get that to happen. If you want to pre-order right now, which you don't have to, but if you want to pre-order right now, you can go to this website, MaccabEanUprising.com, and you can actually, if you want to, pay for it now, and I'll ship it to you later, or you can sign up for it, and I will notify you when it's done, and then you can decide after I notify you, if you want to go ahead and get it or not. But that's the system I have set up right now. Again, I'll be making future announcements when the book actually comes out, and then so this is not your last chance, is what I'm saying. Okay, I'm nervous about this. I'm very nervous to present this, but the conclusions are solid. I should say that not the conclusions are solid, but the trail of breadcrumbs that lead up to this book are taken right out of the Douay-Rheims Bible footnotes and St. Alphonsus and many other sources as well. So I'd have to say, at the very least, it's extremely interesting because it gives interpretations about these key prophecies based on what happened at the Second Vatican Council, which we already know is an abomination of desolation, and we already know has been it's the great apostasy. So wouldn't it make sense if these things were all linked and integral and all point to the same conclusion, the conclusion that we've been defending as Sedevacantist for so long now? What a vindication of the position of Sedevacantism. It's a complete vindication, and it's glorious, so I can't help but present it. All right, that's good for now. Ave Maria, and glory be to God, and I hope to see you again soon.